on objects around object methods. Cool. So objects. Objects one. Oh, okay. So the easiest way to think about an object is that it's an unordered collection of key value pairs, which actually basically just you can think of it. So in JavaScript we call this an object. In Python, it's actually called a dictionary, or a dict for short, DICT. And I actually really like the use of like the mental image of a dictionary to describe an object, because whenever I say an object is a collection of key value pairs, it's the same as saying a dictionary is a collection of words and their definitions, right? And it's the same exact idea in the sense that when you have a dictionary and you have a bunch of words, usually if you want to kind of get the definition associated with a word, you go into the dictionary and you look up the word, right? And that's the exact same thing that happens in JavaScript too, whereas if you want to get the value of an object, you go to the key that's associated with that object, or sorry, with that value, you access a key and that gives you the value. In arrays, we didn't really have this idea of keys and values. We pretty much just had values, right? Implicitly, the keys actually were the indexes, or the indices that were associated with each value in the array. So you can think of it as almost saying the first value of the array is associated with the 0 index, right? The second value of the array is associated with the 1 index, and so on and so forth. In an object, we just make that very, very clear, right? On lines 8 through 11, we see the curly brace syntax here, which means now we're going into, in this case, we're creating a brand new object. And you notice how we have the key and the value, and the key and the value are separated by a colon, okay? And so the key and the value is separated by a colon, and then each key value pair, if you will, is separated by a comma. So the my object on lines 8 through 11, there are two key value pairs. Key 1, or value 1, is associated with key 1. Value 2 is associated with key 2, right? Going back to the analogy of a dictionary, we can say that value 1 is a definition of key 1, and then value 2 is a definition of key 2, right? So to get access to the definition of to get value 1, I'd look up key 1, and similarly for key 2 as well. With arrays, if you remember, we used in order to access any particular element in the array, we use our handy bracket notation, right? And we passed in a number, which indicated a position. Well, here we actually do the same exact thing, except now rather than passing in a number or a position, we actually just pass in the key, right? And in this case, because key 1 is a string, we pass in the string key 1, and this allows us to access value 1. One thing that we're going to talk about in a little bit is just the value of an object can be anything you want it to be. It can be an array, a string, another object, anything you want it to be, a function, anything's fine. But the key of an object has to always be a string. Okay. So we'll see a few ways in which that actually has some interesting consequences for us down the road. But essentially, at a very high level, this is just what an object is. It's a way to store a bunch of values, but then to also associate a key with the value so that we can not just access it easier, but hopefully it also gives us a little bit of information around what the value is actually representing. So let's take a look at and why objects are useful, right? If I give you in line 2 there, if I give you an array and that array has 3 things in it, 3 data points, if you will, it's good data, but it's actually not very clear what we're trying to do there, right? Conceptually speaking, usually we use arrays when we're trying to make a list of something. And if I'm trying to make a list of something, the idea is the elements themselves should be pretty self-explanatory, right? What the array really helps me see is the order in which this list is happening. However, if I look at line 2 here, right, I do have 3 elements, and that array is completely valid, but it's not exactly clear what each of those elements actually means. And so in this scenario, an object is actually the much more appropriate way to store that information. One, because in that list, it looks like order does not matter. So I actually don't need to know why Pusheen comes before 7, or even if it should, right? I just need to know that Pusheen, 7, and Gray and Tabby are in there. And then 2 is I want to be able to associate some kind of metadata, right? Or I want to be able to associate some information that kind of gives me a good sense of what each of those values mean. And so if I was to make Pusheen now into an object, I would actually put name as the key, Pusheen, age That's the age, and then the value for that is going to be the number 7. And notice how each of these key value pairs are separated by a comma. And then lastly, the color is gray and tabby. And now when I look at my Pusheen object, it's a lot more clear to anybody who's reading it. Oh, the name is this, the age is this, and the color is this, right? And so this is one main reason for why objects in some cases are a lot more clear and a lot more useful for storing different data types, right? Because now the key kind of gives me some insight into what those data points are. Compare this with line 2, and on line 2, if you gave it to somebody, someone could be like, I have no idea what those values mean, right? Is 7 the age? Is 7 the number of kittens it has, right? Is 7, something else? But now the key actually makes it pretty clear what we're looking at, right? So this is one reason in which objects are incredibly useful. Not to belabor this point, but type of an object gives you object. So fairly straightforward there. Okay, when we talk about creating objects, I already mentioned the curly brace syntax, and that's something that's going to be consistent with every object you create. But notice how now when I create the Pusheen object, one difference between this and the way I created it 2 slides ago is that notice how name, age, and color are no longer in quotes, right? In fact, if you didn't know any better, you would think they look like variables. And the reason for this is because whereas the value, so everything to the right of the colon, can be any data type you want it to be, the keys of an object are always strings. Okay, you can kind of highlight that. It's just like a hard and fast rule. An object's keys are always going to be strings, and so you can, when you type it out, you can actually skip using the quotation marks. And the reason for that is because JavaScript knows that, hey, if you create an object, your key better be a string. And because I know your key is going to be a string, no matter what you call or no matter what value you give me as a key, I'm going to coerce it. I'm going to cast it into a string for you regardless. And so behind the scenes at some point, when I make this Pusheen object, JavaScript is actually saying, oh, on line 7 there, the name key, let me convert name to a string, and I get back the string name. Okay, like JavaScript will JavaScript will convert everything you give it into a string or will convert every key into a string when you make the object. Okay, on line 8 there, right? Once again, the value is 7. The value can be any data type you want it to be, but the key has to be a string, right? And this kind of makes sense if I go back to my dictionary analogy too, right? For the most part, the vast majority of words that we if we think about a word definition in a dictionary, right? The definition can be a ton of things. The definition can be a picture, it can be a graph, it can be a number, it can be a variety of different things. But the word is almost always going to be a word, right? It's going to be in English, it will be alphabetical, it will have the 26 letters, etc. So in the same way that a traditional dictionary kind of gives the definition a lot of flexibility, but the word has to be an English word. Here, same idea. With the value, we can give it a lot of flexibility, but the key has to be a string. And so because that rule is so strictly enforced, when you make an object, you don't need to specify it. You don't need to put quotes around the key because the key has to be a string, and JavaScript's going to make that coercion for you, regardless of whether or not you want it to, really. Accessing the values of an object, once again, is very straightforward too, right? Now here, notice on line 11, when I access the value, I actually, if I'm trying to access, for example, in this case, a name key, I actually need to I actually need to make sure that the name is put in quotes, because I need to specify that name is a string. And the reason why for that is, well, actually, I'll talk about it on the next slide. But really quick, as a really quick aside here, notice how name, age, and color I'm accessing as strings, and those are going to give me the right things. If on line 14 there, when I access a key that does not exist in an object, JavaScript doesn't throw an error, right? It actually just gives me back undefined, because it knows that, hey, at some point this key might exist, but right now it doesn't. Okay, and so if you ever do try to access a key and you get back undefined, it usually means one of two things. Either the value is intentionally undefined, which is very unlikely, or two is you're trying to access a value that either you misspelled the key, or you are trying to access a key that you just have not created yet. Okay, so just so you know, line 14 there, JavaScript does not throw an error when you try to access a key that does not exist in an object. It will just give you back undefined, and that's something you need to be very careful about. Right, and then so then the other thing I was saying was the reason why when I access an array, when I use bracket notation, the reason why I need to put that key in quotes is to actually differentiate it from when I put in a variable there, right? Because if on line 12 there, if you notice, when I try to access the Pusheen, there's no quotes around key to check, and that's because key to check is not by itself a string, right? It's actually a variable, and that variable on line 10 there, that points to the string name NAME, and so on line 12 that boils down to Pusheen bracket notation NAME this string. Now I can put anything I want in between those brackets as long as eventually it will kind of not calculate, it will evaluate into a string. So on line 13 there, if I look at Pusheen, I have the string COL plus the string OR, and I add them together first. I get back the string COLOR, and then when I do Pusheen, and then I use the index of the string COLOR, and in both cases, it gives me the value that I need. Any questions so far? I know I'm going fairly fast here, but I also think we've already seen a lot of this, not just in your own studies, but with arrays, right? Like a lot of this array syntax should be very familiar by now.
I'm familiar with this, yes, but I do remember watching the videos and learning that if it's multiple words as a key, then you definitely need the quotes and on the left side, right?
Yes,
if
yes,
it's like color space tone.
yes.
But that's
Unless
not. But that's the case. The reality is most style guides that people use, they don't use multi-word keys, right? They don't.
right in JavaScript, traditionally you use camel case or everything. So I think we talked about on
Okay.
day one. So you will very very rarely ever see a key that has multiple words with spaces in between. You should theoretically just see a camel case variable, right? And that's the way you should be writing multiple words in JavaScript. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions so far? I want to make sure I'm not leaving anyone behind as I go through this. Everyone's good?
Yeah, you're just leaving behind the people who didn't do their homework.
Yeah, I guess I also want to be considerate, and I know that we have this classes at night, and so if someone had a busy night, with work or other things, I just want to make sure like when people start the workshop, they're kind of in a spot where they can hopefully move forward and work through some of the problems. Cool. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the question that I think Eric or someone else asked in the beginning, which is basically, well, what if I don't want to use bracket notation, right? What other recourse do I have? And that's something that we use called the dot notation. The dot notation is something that I actually think it's definitely handy. It's a nice shortcut, but it also gets a lot of people who are beginning in a lot of trouble because it is very seductively easy, right? If I look at line 11 there, I could do Pusheen bracket and the string name, or I could just do Pusheen dot name. And notice how there's no quotes around name, and it's because here we're once again we're kind of reinforcing this rule that if I do use dot notation, if you will, instead of bracket notation, if I use dot to access a key, well, whatever comes after the dot has to be a string. Okay, and so therefore I don't need to put quotes around that because it has to be a string. And so when I use it, JavaScript is going to coerce it into a string regardless, right? Like that's just a hard and fast rule. And so now if I look at on line 9, I have this variable called key to check, and I set equal to the string name. On line 11, I'm console logging out pusheen.name, pusheen.age, pusheen.color, and also pusheen.key to check. Okay. What each of those lines does is on line 11, I'm going to look in Pusheen for a key called name and look for the value. Same for lines 12 and 13. I look for keys called age and keys called color, and I get the value back. On line 14, even though on line 9 I said key to check as a variable, it doesn't matter, right? Because on line 14, because I'm using dot notation, I am clearly trying to tell JavaScript, hey, key to check, use that not as a variable, but use it as a string. And so on line 14, JavaScript is actually looking in the Pusheen object, trying to find a key called literally Keytocheck, literally called key to check, not finding it. And remember, if we give it a key that's not in an object, JavaScript gives us back undefined. And so on line 14, when I try to look up key to check, that essentially is a key that does not exist, and so I get back undefined as the value. Okay, and so this is why, and so in one way, the dot notation is slightly less typing, and a bit simpler. But in another way, it's actually quite restricted, right? Because what that means is, because what that means is there's actually situations where I can't use key to check, or sorry, where I can't use dot notation, and that includes if, for example, I only have a variable that points to that. For example, on line 9, if I only know that the variable key to check is going to be a key, right? I didn't know that it pointed to the string name. Well, then it's actually really hard for me to use dot notation. In fact, I cannot use dot notation, right? Because dot notation does not accept variables. It only accepts the actual name of the key. And then similarly to I think Martha's earlier example there, if I do have a key that has spaces in between, well, I also can't do push if the key's name is age space last space year. Well, I can't use dot notation there, right? Or at least I shouldn't be using dot notation there. And so in that case, I should be using a bracket notation. So the rule of thumb here is that bracket notation will always work for every single key that you ever want to access, and dot notation works for a subset of those keys, but it's easier to type, right? And so once again, you're making this trade-off between flexibility / usability and convenience. Okay. So what I always say is, if you're first starting off, is your first time using notation to access objects, I actually would stick with bracket notation just so you don't run into this problem, right? Like just so that you don't run into problems where you're like, well, I'm using dot notation and why isn't the key accessing? Because I guarantee you at some point you're like, the way you're using dot notation is probably not the accepted way. So yeah, so bracket notation works in all scenarios. Dot notation only works in most scenarios. Cool. Just kind of pushing on here, right? The rest of this is very straightforward. Pushing, if I want to add in a key value pair, well, it's literally the same as me just saying, there you go, on lines 10 and 11 there. All I need to do is say, hey, Pusheen, and I set a new key. In this case, if I look at my original Pusheen object, right, there's an image and color. On lines 10 and 11, I can use bracket notation or dot notation, right? If I don't have the equal sign there, that just means I want to access a value. If I have the equal sign there, that means, hey, I want to replace the previous value. Really, if it didn't exist, I want to create it. If it existed, I want to replace it with whatever's on the right-hand side of the equal sign. And so after lines 10 and 11, those are both equally valid ways of me creating this, adding new key value pairs into the object. And then changing a value, it's literally the same exact thing as creating a value. There's almost no difference. I treat it on line 9 there, right? I still use my equal sign. On line 10, I can use plus plus because once again, that just means I'm overriding the previous value of pushing.age with pushing.age plus 1. So changing a value, creating a value, all the same thing. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question, and this was something that Nimit had in his video, and it was kind of what you were saying, like in the bracket notation, it's actually an expression that evaluates. So in the dot notation, you're saying it's just pointing to a string. Well, then I'm confused that you can actually go plus plus, like, or you're saying like that you can actually do any kind of evaluation like that. Or...
Yeah, you can think of this as not exactly, but you can think of it as almost saying it's equal to this. Right. Like this is what plus plus is kind of doing behind the scenes.
Okay.
Like it is an expression, yes, but in our case, we're actually like we're adding a value and then overriding the previous value with a new value. So it boils down to something that looks like this. So like the expression is not happening here.
Right.
The
Yup,
expression
yup,
is
I get that.
happening here.
Yup.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, you can almost put quotes around this if you want to just make it a little bit. It's like that. Yep.
Yeah, that clarified. Thank you.
Yep. Cool.
Well, in that spirit, following Heidi's question,
Yep.
can you do a pushing.age plus equal or multiply equal to 2?
Like, so what you're saying is if I have something like this,
Age
oops,
equals 7.
you're saying
I
age
mean,
equals
age
7.
colon 7.
Yep.
Yeah. And then
You want to do pushing.
pushing.age asterisk equals 2. Or yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. And yeah, so this is the same thing as doing pushing.age plus. This should give us 10, I think, right? Yeah, cool. All right, cool. Yeah, so changing a value, more or less the same thing, right? We just use our handy equal sign as the assignment operator. Oh, shoot. Let's get rid of this so that I don't mess up the slides. Okay. Great. Okay, cool. And then the last thing we'll talk about in terms of kind of the mechanics of an object is this idea of deleting a key value pair. You can do it. There's a reserved word in JavaScript called delete. And when you do delete and then you pass in the key to the object, this is a way to delete both the key and the value. I will just caution and say that, not caution I guess, but I'll just say that this is not used very often. If you think about a dictionary, and go back to an analogy, you don't go through a dictionary and delete all the words you don't use, right? It kind of defeats the purpose. And so usually if you have an object that has a bunch of value you don't need, most times people just leave it there. Like they just don't use it, right? Like with a dictionary, for the words you don't use, you just don't look at them. And that's by far the most common way that people handle unused key value pairs in JavaScript. The place where delete becomes more in handy, I mean, there's two, like one not so good reason and one great reason. The not so good reason is that sometimes if you want to trim down your objects, if you say, hey, this has like 20 things in there and it's really heavy and I can only pass in a limited amount of data, you might delete the object or you might create a new kind of more appropriate version of the object. Like that's one way to handle it. The main reason why people would delete a key value pair is actually for security reasons. So let's say in one object you use, I have your email and your password, right? Well, if I give that object to someone else, I might say, hey, I don't want them to have David's password, right? They can have David's email, that's fine, but I don't want them to have David's passwords. And so they would go into the object and they would delete kind of the more sensitive information, right? So deletion is also a really good way to kind of to keep data security, if you will. But once again, like that's like a very specific use case, and people usually don't delete key value pairs they don't use. They just choose to ignore it. You really only delete it when there's like a need to actually delete it for a very specific reason. So we're just letting you know that this exists, but kind of like our mythical wild loop, you don't see this a lot really in the wild. Okay, any questions so far before we talk about the for and loop, which will be the last thing for tonight?
So just make sure if you declare delete statement like delete pushing in black bracket notation with a key value that doesn't exist, will it give you a syntax error?
No. If you delete a key that doesn't exist, nothing happens, right? So if I go here, oh, yeah, sorry. If I go here and you delete, pushing.david, I don't think it gives you an error. I think it just, oh wait, oh, it just gives you back nothing. Or in this case, I guess it freezes up. I don't think it's this. At least it shouldn't cause any major issues.
Except it uses all your memory.
maybe that's what it's doing. I can do a console log David and push in here and see what happens. I'm not sure why this freezes. Okay, well, it doesn't do anything, I guess, is what you can take away from this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, no, I'm doing my slides. Oh, shoot. Okay, 1 second. Oh, great. Never mind, I had them still. Okay. Draw all these here. I still don't quite understand how math works. Okay, cool. So yeah, so delete. Okay, so the in operator. The in operator is actually a really simple thing. When we use a foreign is where it gets a bit trickier. The in operator is a very easy way to just, it's also a reserved word in JavaScript. And if you put in a string and use the in operator and then use the object, that just gives you back a boolean, true or false. And all that true or false says is, hey, is that string, is that key in the object? And you're going to get back only one of two possible scenarios, true or false. Yes, that string is a key in the object, or no, that string is not a key in the object. You will rarely see this kind of used in isolation. Not saying it's not possible. You definitely will, but in more often cases, when you see the in operator, you actually see it in the context of a for and loop. And so what the for and loop does is, it's a for loop, but it's like a nifty way for us to go through all the keys in an object, right? If you remember the array, we use a for loop to go through the array because we can say, hey, we know all the indexes in the array, and so what the for loop will do is, a for loop is just going to go from 0 to however long the array is. We're going to hit up every single index, right? And if I know every single index, then I should at some point be able to get access to every single element in the array. So with an object, we no longer have those indexes, right? There's no longer a position, there's no longer like an order, but there are these keys. And so what the for and loop does is, the for and it looks like this on line 9 there. It looks like for let, for example, Vicky in Pusheen, and Vicky is just a random variable name that I picked just so you know that's just a random variable. So just to kind of break it down a little bit, the for is a reserved word, right? That's indicates we're in a for loop. Let Vicky, that's the same as when we say let I equals 0 or let David equals, whatever it is. That's just us creating an arbitrary variable, okay? In Pusheen, right? The in is the reserved word and the Pusheen is the object. And when we do that, what this actually says is, what the for loop is actually doing is, the for loop is going to say, hey, I am going to go through every single key in the object for you, and the variable representing that key is going to be, in this case, Vicky. Okay? And so if I say, here's a loop that goes through every single key in the object for you, well, it also means, hey, at some point, you will have access to every single value in this object, right? If I say this dictionary has 10 words and I will let you know what each of those words are, well, if you know the word, then you also know how to get access to the definition associated with that word, right? And so here on line 10, notice, or lines 9 through 11, really, if I look at this, for and loop, right? Vicky is my variable, Pusheen is the object. And so when I say for let Vicky in Pusheen, and when I console log it out, I'm saying Pusheen's, the variable Vicky is, and then I do Pusheen's index Vicky, right? What Vicky is actually saying is, or what Vicky is it's the key, right? And so that's why when I look at the console log, I see Pusheen's name, Pusheen's age, Pusheen's color, is, and then the second variable there is Pusheen index Vicky, right? And so that's asking you, what is the value in Pusheen associated with Vicky, right? Rather, what is the value associated with that key in that object? And so this is kind of the one thing that the for loop kind of does behind the scenes for you, right? Is it actually goes through and it will, at some point, every time you run it, the key will have a new value. The key will be the value of a new key in Pusheen, and that loop will run over and over and over again until the key has represented every single key in the pushing object. And so this is a way for us to go through and access every single key and therefore every single value in the pushing object. We don't have a for loop, we have a for loop. And there's no way, so with the for loop, we can say, let's start here, stop here, and go every x, every x times. A for loop doesn't have that luxury. A for loop is all or nothing, in that if you don't use it, then you're not going to go through any key or keys in the object. Or if you do use a for loop, you go through every single key in the object. I'm sorry? Hello? Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So we lost. So it's her, right? Not me.
No, you're still here. It was her.
Okay, cool. Is that Martha?
Yes, it's my mother who's creating some drama in the background. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. No, okay. Sorry. Did you have a question, or I thought I heard you start to ask something, or it's just background noise?
I did. Yeah, no, background noise, and and I couldn't ask you a question, but now she's gone. Okay, good. Sorry about that, guys.
Okay.
The wiki could be any word, any Jupyter dash, right? Anything. It doesn't have to be
It's just
wiki, right?
it's just a variable. Yep, it's just a variable.
Okay.
So you can call it whatever you want.
And there's no, I guess there's no danger of creating an infinite loop because the loop is just the length of the object.
Yes, it's the objects technically have no length, so it's a number of keys in the object. Is just to be more precise with the way I say it.
Okay, that's good to know. I didn't actually, that's good. That brings up another thought. So that means that we can't do like object.length.
Right? Yeah. That's theoretically does not exist. I think you get back undefined or something if you try to use that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. So I believe I think that's pretty much it for us, right? So that's a for loop. And yep, we usually go through every single, in this case, I can just call it a key and call it anything. One thing to note, right, and I think this speaks to Eric's earlier point, right? If I use a for loop, I can't use dot notation, right? Because on line 10 there, when I do pushing.key, that is literally telling JavaScript, hey, go to pushing and look for this this key called KEY. And pushing.key is a string, so that will never change. And so when you do it, what you're actually going to get is you're looking up the same quote-unquote KEY key every single time. And so if you're using a for loop, don't use dot notation. Always use bracket notation.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yes, thanks. This is a probably like this sets me back because sometimes I forget the most basic thing. But when that previous slide,
Yep.
on line 10,
Yep.
how come you didn't use any concats, and it still gave you a full sentence, and you didn't even use the string, the backticks to create that sentence? How did that?
There's many ways to create a string. Backticks are a way to use something called string interpolation, whereas you just kind of fill in the blanks with the different variables. I can use
You didn't use that or concats. It just
right.
They ignored all the commas.
Right. So the backticks are a way to do string interpolation, and that's one way to create a string. The plus sign is concat, and that's another way to do a string. If in this case, actually, I'm not creating one single string. What console.log does is whatever number of arguments you give it, it will just print it out in sequence. And so in this case, all console.log is doing is it's printing out like those 4 elements: pushings, the key, the is, and the pushing.key in sequence. So I'm actually never creating a single string that looks like that, or at least I don't think console.log is. But right now I'm just leveraging the fact that if I give console log 10 arguments, it will just print out all 10 of those arguments in a row.
Right, but it breaks a line for each row, which is
right, because each console log is a new command to JavaScript, and so when I say like it prints it out in a row, it's just like saying like it's just kind of sequentially prints it, like not each as its own console log command, but all as part of one command.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. And then last but not least, and this is something that I'll show it to you guys, but you don't use this as a crutch. One way to access all the keys in an object is to use the object.keys. Notice how the O is capitalized, which means now we're going back to our universe where we deal with class methods. And if I do object.keys and I pass in an object, that returns to me an array with all the keys. Okay. Now, just know that this gives me back an array with all the keys. If I do object.values, that gives me back an array with all the values. Okay, but those two are separate things. And so this is something that I would say you should use sparingly. Like I said, like Java, like when you your choice of what to use when you code is actually very important, and people will always kind of ask you why you chose to use it. It just means be intentional. Like if you use an object, it means there's a lot of like really valuable ways you want to see this information being portrayed as an object. If you're using objects and just converting it into an array and then using it, it means you should either have used arrays to start with, or you're not finding kind of the right way to represent your data. So this is just to show you that object.keys does exist, but it's not something that you should be using super often. The last thing here to note is that this is the same as kind of our lesson yesterday on nested arrays and the grid. Is the values of an array the values of an object can be anything, including an array. And if I use my kind of chaining principle that we learned about yesterday with the grid, here on line 10 or line 11, if I do pushing.colors, that gives me back an array. And then if I do index 0, it just means gives me the first element in the array, or index 1, which says gives me the second element in the array. So I can actually also use arrays as values too, and I don't have to do pushing.colors or x equals pushing.colors x index 0. I can just do pushing.colors index 0. And then similarly for objects, same exact idea, right? I can have nested arrays, I can have nested objects too. And so here if I do pushing.siblings, that just says, hey, give me the value associated with pushing.siblings. And that value happens to be an object. I'm saying, all right, great, give me the value associated with that sister key in that object. In this case, I get back Stormy. If I do pushing, I'll just do this here. If I do, in this case, if I do pushing, right, dot siblings, which is here, dot brother, I get back this value called pip. And when I print it out, the sister prints out Stormy, and the brother prints out pip. And that's pretty much it, right? So we covered a lot of kind of, a little bit all over the place with regards to objects. It is an intro to objects. But hopefully a lot of this is straightforward to understand. Although I will say that, this workshop can be pretty tricky. So, as you go through it, definitely let us know if you need help. But this is a workshop in which I'm almost sure, this is definitely a workshop in which you should be thinking more than you're coding, right? Because it's actually really easy to just start writing code and get lost in a rabbit hole. Before you write the solution, always try to think through, what are you actually trying to do, right? Don't just start writing, loops and stuff and hope that you'll kind of bump into the answer. Make sure you actually think about what you're trying to do and make sure that the idea makes sense to you conceptually in your head before you write the code for it. Because at some point, writing the code becomes the easy part. Thinking of the solution is much more challenging.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
In order to iterate through an object that has nested arrays or a nested object as a value, do we only use the for in loop?
It depends, right? So if I have something that looks like this, and I want to loop through that, well, I would just still write the for, and then my traditional let I equal 0. Here I do I is less than pushing dot or arr dot length, and then I plus plus, right? And now this will help me loop through the array. If I do have something else that looks like obj, and it's obj, it's called key 1, and it's called David, and then key 2, and it's called Alec. Well, in this case, then I would use my for in loop to say, for let key in pushing.obj. Yeah, so it really depends upon what you're dealing with. And I'll select this out too. Cool.
I'm sorry, and just because you use the dot notation for both examples out of preference, or because it's requirement for the for loops?
No, you can always use bracket notation for anything. Anywhere where you can use dot, you can use bracket notation, but not everywhere where you use bracket, you can use dot notation. So the limitation works in one direction. So this is the way to do it in bracket notation too. Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, so the for loop on line 10,
Here, yep.
that will return everything in Pusheen, right? Like,
Well, it depends on what I do with it, right? So right now, my I starts at 0, and my I is less than pushing ARR dot length, and so the pushing ARR dot length, right? Length is equal to 3.
right.
So I'm gonna have I equals 0, right? I equals 1, and then I equals 2. So now the question becomes, what do I want to do with that information? If all I want to do is just console log out, and I'll say, you know, pushing dot ARR index of I. Well, if I do that, then I'm going to print out 1, 2, and then 3. Right? If I change this to 4, 5, and 6, I'm going to print out 4, 5, and 6. So this just gives me a variable that I can use that's based on the length of this array, so I can iterate through this array. In this case, what this does is this actually gives me an ability to actually go through every single key in this value, which happens to be an object, right? So if I do console.logout key, and then I also console.logout, let me just put a set of asterisks here so we can make sure we don't get confused between each row printouts, right? If I print out the key and I print out pushing.obj index of key, notice how up here I print out my 4, 5, and 6, and then down here, every time I do it, I'm printing out key, which is in one instance is equal to key 1, and next instance equals to key 2, right? Which matches what I have here. And then in each case, the value is pushing.obj, and then I put in that key, right? And so when I do it for key 1, it gives me back David, and for key 2, it gives me back Alec.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yes, I think the key thing to remember, no pun intended, is that the only way to iterate through an object is using the for in loop method, or is that what do you call that?
It's not a method. It's just
what do you call it?
it's just a loop, right? It's got like a for loop. It's a loop. It's a for loop.
Oh yes, okay. So the only way to iterate through an object is using the for in loop.
No. Yeah. Now, I mean, you could also do it using the object.keys and then iterating through the array of keys. But the for in loop is kind of what you should be using because that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to replace like you doing extra work by going through the array of keys.
And object.values and object.keys, which has the O in objects capitalized, is a crutch because it only gives you half the information. Is that why?
Yep.
It's a crutch?
Yep.
Okay.
It gives you half information. Yep.
And what that's I forget. It's a capital O because it's a constructor.
No, because it's the object class. I mean, I guess you can think of the class as a constructor, but it's like the value there is like the dot keys is considered a method on the object class, and so what we're doing is we're just leveraging like kind of this built-in function in the object class. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, if not, then we'll let you get started on your workshops.
I'm just letting you know. I'm so happy I took your class